Section 8 of The Light of Egypt, or the Science of the Soul and the Stars, Volume 2. The Light of Egypt, or the Science of the Soul and the Stars, Volume 2, by Thomas Burgoyne. Chapter 7, Alchemy, Part 1. What a weird yet strangely pleasing name the term alchemy is. It is simple, yet so infilled and intermixed with the possible verities of exact science and the philosophical speculations on the infinite and the unknown as to elude our mental grasp, as it were, by its own subtle essence, and defy the keenest analysis of our profoundest generalizers in science. And yet, in spite of this self-evident truth, how fascinating the sound of the word becomes to the mystic student's ear, and bow pregnant with awful and mysterious possibilities it becomes to the immortal powers embodied within the complex human organism termed man. Words, if we but knew it, have the same innate magnetic influence, and possess the same power of affinity and antipathy that the human family possesses, as well as all organic and inorganic forms and substances. And how sad to a developed soul to witness the inharmony existing in our midst, caused by the misapplication of names. Most human beings are very conscious of personal or human magnetism and its effects, but they stop right there and do not dream of the subtle, silent influences emanating from a name, a word, and the power existing in words when properly used. The human mind is so absorbed in nature's manifestations, which are the only husk, that they fail to see the true, hidden meaning and realities concealed beneath the material shell. We will first notice the meaning of the words which constitute our subject, viz., alchemy, then give a brief review of its physical correspondence, chemistry, and its true relation to its spiritual counterpart, alchemy. Al and chemi are Arabic Egyptian words, which have much more in them than appears upon the surface, and possess a far different meaning from the one which the terms usually convey to the average mind. Terms and the ideas we associate with them vary according to the age in which we live. So with those from which the word alchemy is derived. Let us penetrate beneath the mere verbal husk with which linguistic usage and convenience have clothed them, and which, in the course of ages, has become nothing but the dross of decomposed verbiage, and see if we can excavate the living germ that has become buried within. If we can do so, we shall, at the commencement of our study, have attained unto a realization of the ancient meaning and real significance of the terms employed, and this will be no small gain, and will form no unimportant part of the equipment in our present research. The Arabians, who derived the whole of their occult arcana from the Egyptians, are the most likely to render us the most truthful and direct significance of the word, and so we find them thus: al, meaning the, and chemia, which means the hidden or secret, ergo, the occult, from which are derived our modern term alchemy, more properly alchemia. This is very different from the popular conception today, which supposes that the word relates to the art of artificial making gold by some chemical process, and viewing it only as some sort of magical chemistry, forgetting that the science of chemistry correction. The Arabians, who derive the whole of their occult arcana from the Egyptians, are the most likely to render us the most truthful and direct significance of the word, and so we find them thus: al, meaning the, and chemia, which means the hidden or secret, ergo, the occult, from which are derived our modern term alchemy, more properly alchemia. This is very different from the popular conception today, which supposes that the word relates to the art of artificially making gold by some chemical process, and viewing it only as some sort of magical chemistry, forgetting that the science of chemistry itself is also derived from the chemia of Arabian mystics, and was considered as one and the same thing by every writer of the Middle Ages. At this time the physical man was not so dense and grasping for husks, hence the soul and spiritual part had greater control, and could impart the real, the alchemical side of nature to him. Hence the law of correspondences was understood, and guided the educated in their considerations, researches, and conclusions. Do you ask why, if they were so enlightened, they availed their knowledge from the world at large? The power of mind over matter was as potent in those days as now, and the masses were as correspondingly corrupt as they are today. Therefore, to put this knowledge into the hands of the multitude would have been generally disastrous. So they wrote it in mystical language, knowing that all educated students in nature's law at that time would understand. Yet they little dreamed how much their language would be misunderstood in the centuries to follow by those who looked to their ancient ancestry for aid on subjects that have become, at the present day, so lost in mystery. Having ascertained beyond question that alchemy was, and consequently is, the secret science of occultism, not the philosophy, mind you, but the science, let us proceed, for we shall find that these two aspects may often differ, or appear to differ, widely from each other, though they can never do so in reality, for the latter produces and establishes the facts, while the former occupies itself in their tabulation and deductions. The science constitutes the foundation, and the philosophy, the metaphysical speculations which rest thereon. If these important distinctions are borne in mind, all the apparent confusion, contradiction, and other intellectual debris will either disappear or resolve themselves into their own proper groups, so that we may easily classify them. It is at this very point that so many students go astray amid the labyrinths of science and philosophy. They unconsciously so mix and intermingle the two terms that 9/10 of the students present only one side of the question, philosophy, which soon runs into theory, if not supported by the science which they have lost in their volumes of philosophy. You may say, one subject at a time. Yes, this may be true if its twin brother is not absorbed and forgotten. In this chapter we shall deal especially with organic alchemy. Organic alchemy deals exclusively with living organic things, and in this connection differs from the alchemy of inorganic matter. These two aspects may, in this one respect, be compared to organic and inorganic chemistry, to which originally they belonged, as astrology did to astronomy. Alchemy and astrology, twin sisters, were the parents of the modern offspring, known in chemistry and astronomy as exact sciences. These latter, however, deal with shadows and phenomenal illusions, while the former concern the living realities which produce them. Therefore, there can be no new thing under the sun, saith Solomon. First, let us deal with the most lovely form of our art, that which pertains to the floral and vegetable kingdoms. Every flower or blade of grass, every tree of the forest, and stagnant weed of the swamp, is the outcome of, and ever surrounded by, its corresponding degree of spiritual life. There is not a single atom but what is the external expression of some separate living force within the spaces of eighth, acting in unison with the dominant power corresponding with the type of life. If science could only behold this wonderful laboratory within the vital storehouse of nature, she would no longer vainly seek for the origin of life, nor wonder what may have become of the missing link in scientific evolution, because she would quickly realize that biogenesis is the one grand truth of both animate and inanimate nature, the central living source of which is God. Science would also further realize that this biune life is ever in motion throughout the manifested universe, circulating around the foci of creative activities, which we term suns, stars, and planets, awaiting the conditions which are ever present for material incarnation, and under all possible combinations of circumstances and conditions, conceivable and inconceivable, adapting itself to continuous phenomenal expression. Links, so called, in this mighty chain of evolution may appear to be missing here and there, and, for that matter, whole types may seem to be wanting, but this is only because of our imperfect perception, and, in any case, can make no real difference with the facts, because, if such be a reality, if there be what we may term missing links in the schemes of evolution, it only shows that spirit, although associated with, is ever independent of matter. But matter, what is to become of it? Is it independent of spirit? The kindness of the divine spirit heeds not the unconscious mind of matter and its boasted independence, and works silently on, and at last accomplishes its mission, the evolution of matter, the uplifting of the soul of man as well as the universe. The blindness of man is dense, and the saddest part to admit is that they will so stubbornly remain so. If, for one instant, the penetrating eye of the soul could shine forth through the physical orbs of vision, and imprint the scenes beheld behind the veil upon the tablets of the brain of the physical organism, a fire would be kindled that could never be quenched by the fascinating allurements of the material, perishable things of matter. That development of the real atom of biune life can and does go forward, irrespective of the gradation of physical types, needs no convincing proof other than visible nature. Man is not the outcome of physical evolution and produced by a series of blind laws that lead him upward from protozoa to man, as a child climbs upstairs, advancing regularly, one step at a time. This later conception, we know, is the theory of exact science, but not of alchemy, not of the science of occultism. Man, according to Wallace, Darwin, Huxley, and Tyndall, is what progressive stages of physical evolution have made him. But the very reverse is true. The fauna and flora of past geological periods are what the human soul has produced, by virtue of its gradual advancement to higher states and conditions of life, so that, so far from man being the outcome of the planet's development, such material progress is the outgrowth of man's advancement, proving again that matter is not independent of spirit, neither can spirit be independent of matter for its expressions. They so interblend that the dividing line cannot be detected by the untrained eye of the exact scientist, but that time is not far distant when the scientists will prepare and evolve their interior being to take up the spiritual thread exactly where the visible thread ends, and carry forth the work as far as the mortal mind of man can penetrate, while embodied in the physical form. God hasten this day is my prayer, for then man will become more spiritual and aspiring for advancement and knowledge, thus setting up vibrations that will create higher and loftier conditions for the physical man. Aye, then they will know that even the birth of the world itself owes its primal genesis to the desire of the human atom for earthly embodiment. Here is where exact science, or the counterpart of alchemy, becomes both profitable and helpful. Says Paracelsus, the true use of chemistry is not to make gold, but to prepare medicines. He admits 4 elements: the star, the root, the element, and the sperm. These elements were composed of the 3 principles: sideric salt, sulfur, and mercury. Mercury, or spirit sulfur, or oil and salt, and the passive principles, water and earth. Herein we see the harmony of the 2 words, alchemy and chemistry. One is but the continuation of the other, and they blend so into each other that they are not complete apart. The chemist, in his analysis of the various component parts of any form of matter, knows also the proportional combinations, and thus, by the law of correspondence, could, by the same use of the spiritual laws of alchemy, analyze and combine the same elements from the atmosphere to produce the corresponding expression of crystallized form. By the same laws are affinities and antipathies discovered and applied in every department of nature's wonderful laboratory. Chemistry is the physical expression of alchemy, and any true knowledge of chemistry is, not the knowing of the names of the extracts and essences and the plants themselves, and that certain combinations produce certain results obtained from blind experiments, yet prompted by the divine spirit within, but knowledge born from knowing the why and wherefore of such effects. What is called the oil of olives is not a single simple substance, but it is more or less combined with other essential elements, and will fuse and culls with other oils and essences of similar nature. The true chemist will not confine his researches for knowledge to the mere examination, analysis, and experiments in organic life, but will inform himself equally in physical astrology, and learn the nature, attributes, and manifested influence of the planets that constitute our universe, and under which every form of organic matter is subject and especially controlled by. Then, by learning the influence of the planets upon the human family and that special planetary vibration that influences the individual, he can intelligently and unerringly administer medicines to remove disease in man. A familiarity with the mere chemical relations of the planet to man makes still more apparent the mutual affinity of both to the soil from which they appear to spring and to which they ultimately return, so much so that we have become conscious that the food we eat is valuable, or otherwise as a life sustainer, in proportion to the amount of life it contains. We are so complex in our organization that we require a great variety of the different elements to sustain all the active functions and powers within us. Man, being a microcosm or a miniature universe, must sustain that universe by taking into the system the various elements which combine to make up the infinite universe of God. Animal flesh is necessary to certain organized forms, both animal and man. When I say necessary, I do not mean an acquired taste and habit of consuming just so much flesh a day, but a constitution which would not be complete in its requirements without animal flesh. I am thankful such do not constitute the masses. Science would say you only require certain combinations of oxygen, hydrogen, nitrogen, and carbon to sustain all the activities of the physical body. Apparently, this is true. Upon the surface, it is. But in reality, it is not, because if it were really true, there could be no famines. Science could make bread out of stones, as was suggested at the temptation of Christ in the wilderness. And yet, no one knows better than the academies of science themselves that their learned professors would quickly starve to death if they were compelled to produce their food from the chemical properties of the rocks. They can make a grain of wheat chemically perfect, but they cannot make the invisible germ by which it will grow, become fruitful, and reproduce itself. They can reproduce from the stones in the street the same chemical equivalents that go to compose gluten, albumin, and starch, their trinity which must always be present to sustain life, but they cannot, by any known process, make such chemical equivalents of these substances do the same thing. Now, if not, why not? Science cannot answer this. A very mysterious shake of the head and profound silence is the only answer. Ask science how the plant grows, what causes the atoms of matter to build up root, stem, leaf, bud, and flower, true to the parent species from which the germinal atom came. What is there behind the plant that stamps it with such striking individuality? And why, from the same soil, the deadly aconite and nutritious vegetables can grow, each producing qualities in harmony with its own nature, so widely different in their effects upon the human organism, yet so completely identical as regards the source from which they appear to spring? There must be a something to account for this, and this something, ancient alchemy alone can scientifically reveal and expound, and this knowledge lies just beyond that line which calls a halt to material scientists and says, "You can go no farther. This is beyond your purview. The end of the material thread has been reached, and unless you can connect it with the thread of the next plane, your researches must stop." Before entering upon and answering these vital questions, we must digress a little and make ourselves perfectly familiar with the ideas and revelations of advanced physical science upon the subject, and for this purpose no more trustworthy guide can be consulted than the new edition of The Chemistry of Common Life, by the late James F.W. Johnson, M.A., England, and revised by Arthur Herbert Church, M.A., in Chapter 4 on page 56 of this work, upon the anatomy of plant life, we read: "How interesting it is to reflect on the minuteness of the organs by which the largest plants are fed and sustained. Microscopic apertures in the leaf suck in gaseous food from the air. The surface of microscopic hairs suck a liquid food from the soil. We are accustomed to admire with natural and just astonishment how huge rocky reefs, hundreds of miles in length, can be built up by the conjoined labors of myriads of minute zoophytes laboring together on the surface of a coral rock. But it is not less wonderful that, by the ceaseless working of similar microscopic agencies in leaf and root, the substance of vast forests should be built up and made to grow before our eyes. It is more wonderful, in fact, for whereas, in the one case, the chief result is that dead matter extracted from the sea is transformed into a dead rock, in the other, the lifeless matter of the earth and air are converted by these minute plant builders into living forms, lifting their heads aloft to the sky, waving with every wind that blows, and beautifying whole continents with the varying verdure of their ever-changing leaves. Further on in the same chapter, on pages 62 through 3, the same eloquent writer continues: But the special chemical changes that go on within the plant, could we follow them, would appear not less wonderful than the rapid production of entire microscopic vegetables from the raw food contained in the juice of the grape. It is as yet altogether incomprehensible, even to the most refined physiological chemistry, how, from the same food taken in from the air, and from generally similar food drawn up from the soil, different plants and different parts of plants should be able to extract or produce substances so very different from each other in composition. But the special chemical changes that go on within the plant, could we follow them, would appear not less wonderful than the rapid production of entire microscopic vegetables from the raw food contained in the juice of the grape. It is as yet altogether incomprehensible, even to the most refined physiological chemistry, how, from the same food taken in from the air, and from generally similar food drawn up from the soil, different plants and different parts of plants should be able to extract or produce substances so very different from each other in composition and in all of their properties. From the seed vessels of one, the poppy, we collect a juice which dries up into our commercial opium. From the bark of another, cinchona, we extract the quinine with which we assuage the raging fever. From the leaves of others, like those of hemlock and tobacco, we distill deadly poisons, often of rare value for the correction. We distill deadly poisons, often of rare value for their medicinal uses. The flowers and leaves of some yield volatile oils, which we delight in for their odors and the aromatic qualities. The seeds of others give fixed oils, which are prized for the table or use in the arts. These and 1,000 other similar facts tell us how wonderfully varied are the changes which the same original forms of matter undergo in the interior of living plants. Indeed, whether we regard the vegetable as a whole or examine its minutest part, we find equal evidence of the same diversity of changes and of the same production, in comparatively minute quantities, of very different, yet often characteristic forms of matter. From the whole of the foregoing, we observe the exact position to be the one we have previously stated. If such wondrous things can be revealed to us through the physical science of chemistry, what think you must be hidden from our physical sight and knowledge by the veil which hangs between matter and spirit? Think you not it is worth the effort to penetrate beyond that point where the atom disappears from the view of the scientist? If plants produce such wonderful phenomena in their life and influence, what must the divine organism of man have concealed within his microscopic universe to study and comprehend? Plant life is merely the alphabet of the complex, intricate, and multitudinous processes going on in the human body. And as the mechanical microscope of physical science cannot reveal the why and the wherefore, let us, for a brief moment, disclose some of the wonders that declare their existence when subjected to the penetrating alchemical lens of the inward spirit. The first thing that intrudes itself upon our notice by virtue of its primary importance is the grand fact of biogenesis, life emanating from life. We perceive every external form to be the physical symbol of a corresponding degree of spiritual life, that each complete plant represents a complete cycle, state, or degree of interior existence, that it is made up and consists of countless millions of separate atoms of life, that these atoms of spiritual activity are the real instigators of the life and motion of corresponding material atoms, that they ever obey the divine impulse of co-operative unity in their chemical as well as their spiritual affinity. Consequently, everything in the form of material substance must be, and is, but the means for the phenomenal expression of incarnating spirit, the organism of man, a tree, a plant, or an animal, being no exception to this divine, omnipresent law of creative life. To the true alchemist, there can be no mystery surrounding the wonderful phenomena mentioned in the work we have quoted. In plants extracting from the same rock, soil, and air, qualities so manifestly different, deadly poisons, healing balsams, and pleasant aromas, or the reverse, from the same identical plant foods. Nothing is more wonderful or mysterious than the same alchemical processes which are hourly being enacted within our own bodies. From the same breath of air and the same crust of bread do we concoct the blood, the bile, the gastric juice, and various other secretions, and distill the finer nervous fluids that go to build up and sustain the whole of our mental and dynamic machinery. It is the same ancient story of the atoms, each part and each function endowing the same inorganic chemicals with their own spiritual, magnetic, and physical life qualities, by what appears to the uninitiated observer a miraculous transmutation of matter, but which is, in reality, the evolution of organic form from inorganic materials in obedience to the divine law of spiritual progression. Who could stop with exact science? For when we come to consider the apparent mysteries of life and growth by the aid of this alchemical light, the shadow flee and all the illusions of nature's phenomenal kaleidoscope vanish before the revelation of the underlying spiritual realities. We know that the plant, being the physical expression upon the material plane of a more interior life, endows its outward atoms with their peculiar qualities. These qualities are not drawn directly from the soil only becoming the medium for their complete or incomplete expression, as the case may be, i.e., supplying the necessary inorganic atoms. Hence, the deadly qualities of aconite and the generous, life-sustaining qualities of the nutritious vegetable being spiritual life endowments, conveyed to the material substance, abstracted from the soil, and withdrawn from the atmosphere, are no mystery, their effect upon the human organism being exactly that which is produced by their spiritual affinity or antipathy, as the case may be. And this also shows and explains why purely inorganic chemical atoms, though they be exactly the same as the organic substances from a strictly scientific standpoint, yet fail to support life, because such chemical equivalents lack the organic spirituality of the interior life, which alone gives them the power and function to support the same. They fail to fulfill the requirements of the alchemical law of life for the support of life, in other words, biogenesis. And too, this inorganic life may be parted from the plant or vegetable, if it be too long severed from the medium which transmits the spiritual life from the inorganic world to that of organic matter. Vegetables, fresh from the ground or parent stem, retain this life if at once prepared for food, if not overcooked, which is so often ignorantly done. This is the secret of sustenance from foods. Nature's perfected fruits and vegetables are overflowing with the life-giving essences, and if eaten direct from the tree or parent stem, that life is not lost but transmitted to our organisms and replenishes the wasting system with a living life. Much less of such food is required to completely satisfy and nourish the body than if the life had partly departed or been destroyed. Briefly stated, then, everything within organic nature is the expressional symbolic manifestation of spirit. every form being a congregation of innumerable atoms of life, revealing their presence in material states, each organic form, or rather organism, evolving under the central control of some dominating deific atom or soul, which by virtue of past incarnations and labors in its cycle of evolution from the mineral up to man, has achieved the royal prerogative to rule within its own state. Man being the highest representative form, man being the highest representative form, the grand finale in the earthly drama, sums up and contains within himself everything below, and the germs of everything beyond this state. He is truly a microcosm, and represents in miniature the grand cosmic man's of the heavens. Every living force beneath him corresponds to some state, part, or function, which he has graduated through and conquered, and which, in him, has now become embodied as a part of his universal kingdom. Consequently, all things are directly related to him in the grand universal unity of spiritual life. This cannot be realized and comprehended by the physical man, nor conveyed to his outer senses by the physical sciences. He must bring into active use the inner man, the real being, which inhabits and controls the outer organism, and through its instrumentality understand the interior source and workings behind the phenomena of manifested being. So we see that exact science cannot take us far, yet it is a mighty factor in the evolution of the microcosm man, and in consciously relating him to the infinite macrocosm, God, Spirit, all. End of section 8. Section 9 of The Light of Egypt, or the Science of the Soul and the Stars, Volume 2. The Light of Egypt, or the Science of the Soul and the Stars, Volume 2, by Thomas Burgoyne. Chapter 8. Alchemy, Part 2. Paracelsus, the most celebrated of the alchemists of the Middle Ages, thus mystically speaks of his art. If I have manna in my constitution, I can attract manna from heaven. Melissa is not only in the garden, but also in the air and in heaven. Saturn is not only in the sky, but also deep in the ocean and earth. What is Venus but the Artemisia that grows in your garden? And what is iron but the planet Mars? That is to say, Venus and Artemisia are both products of the same essence, while Mars and iron are manifestations of the same cause. What is the human body but a constellation of the same powers that form the stars in the sky? He who knows Mars knows the qualities of iron, and he who knows what iron is knows the attributes of Mars. What would become of your heart if there were no sun in the universe? What would be the use of your vasa spermatica if there were no Venus? To grasp the invisible elements, to attract them by their material correspondences, to control, purify, and transmute them by their ever-moving powers of the living spirit. This is true alchemy. Thus, in a very few simple words, we find this master of the art revealing the whole arcana of that mysterious science, which has for its chief object and goal the discovery of the philosopher's stone, which confers upon its fortunate possessor the blessings of immortal youth. Therefore, we cannot possibly do better in the commencement of our present study than to minutely examine each particular sentence and endeavor to discover his true meaning, which, like all mystical writing, is so apparent, yet cunningly concealed as to excite the student's admiration. If I have manna in my constitution, I can attract manna from heaven. The manna here spoken of does not specify any particular thing, but is of universal application, and is simply used as an unknown quantity, like XYZ in mathematics. But, ever since the days of Paracelsus, half-initiated mystics and bookworm occultists have endeavored to discover what this manna really was. Some, the more spiritual, were of the opinion that it was spiritual power or purity of spirit. Others imagined it to mean special magnetic qualifications, similar in nature to the so-called gifts of modern spiritualistic media. The concealment of the truth is unique and consists in its very simplicity and, when correctly expounded, should read, I am the microcosm, and all the visible and invisible universe dwells within me, so that whatsoever power I have in my constitution, I can attract its correspondence from heaven. Paracelsus must have smiled to himself when he wrote, if I have manna, etc., because his whole writings strive to prove the man. Correction. Paracelsus must have smiled to himself when he wrote, if I have manna, etc., because his whole writings strive to prove man the miniature of deity. Further along, he explains himself by pointing out the real law of correspondence. Thus, Melissa is not only in the garden, but also in the air and in heaven. Saturn is not only in the sky, but also deep in the ocean and earth. The illustrations are beautiful. The life of the plant, the animal floralis, pervades the atmosphere and the interior states of spiritual life, where it becomes in the highest degree beautiful and beneficial to the soul. A reference upon this point to The Light of Egypt, Volume 1, may not be considered out of place. Upon page 74 it is written, the flower that blooms in beauty, breathing forth to the air its fragrance, which is at once grateful to the senses and stimulating to the nerves, is a perfect specimen of nature's faultless mediumship. The flower is a medium for the transmission to the human body of those finer essences and of their spiritual portion to the soul, for the aroma of the flower is spiritualized to such a degree as to act upon the life currents of the system, imparting to the spiritual body a nutriment of the finest quality. Thus, here is where the knowledge of the alchemical attributes of plants, as applicable to man, can be most beneficially utilized. Plants and flowers whose attributes and aromas harmonize with the complex organism of man should be selected for the house and garden, for they are mediums to transmit the finer essences and aromas to the spiritual constitution of man, the plant to the physical, and the aromas and essences of the flowers to the soul. Antipathies in plants and flowers would bring a similar evil influence as the discords of the antagonistic human magnetism. It would not be so apparent, but more subtle, yet nevertheless effective in result. Our attention is next drawn to the planet Saturn, which we are informed is not only shining in his starry sphere of the heavens, but is also buried in the ocean depths and embodied in the stratas of the earth. It is almost needless to add that our author refers to those substances naturally Saturnian in their quality of life and expression, such as lead, clay, and coal among the minerals, and various deadly plants among the flora, the chief of which is the aconite or monkshood, so significant of Saturn and the isolated monkish hermit. After some repetition, in order to impress the truth of correspondences, our author exclaims, "What is the human body but a constellation of the same powers that form the stars in the sky? Truly, what else? For he who knows Mars knows the qualities of iron, and he who knows what iron is knows the attributes of Mars. Could anything be plainer? We think not." From the foregoing, which a long experience and much critical investigation and research have demonstrated as true, we cannot avoid the conclusion that alchemy, equally as well as every other science, religion, or system of philosophy formulated by man, resolves itself, ultimately, in all its final conclusions, into the one universal parent of all wisdom. Astrology, the science of the stars, in unison with the science of the soul, was, and still is, the one sublime center of real learning. It constituted the sacred fountain of living waters, from whose placid depths there rayed forth the divine revelations of man, his whence, where, and whither, and under the careful conservation of a long line of gifted seers, it shone forth to the sons of men as a sacred Hermetic light in the astro-Masonic window of Egypt's ancient priesthood. It is not lost to us today. The same book lies open before us that faced our ancient forefathers. It is standing out clear and distinct, waiting to be read by the sons of men. We can learn its language, and from its pages we ourselves can read our relation to God and our fellow men. Shall we not heed the whispering intuitions of the soul, and place ourselves in conscious rapport with the whole? This sublime book of wisdom was written by God Himself to convey to His children the knowledge of His powers, attributes, and relation to all creative life. We cannot see that divine spirit which we call God, no, but as long as the finite form exists as such, we will have the spirit's manifestations to learn from. Never will the book of God be closed to the searching eye of the soul. There will always be presented to his vision lessons to study and practical experiments to perform, to lead the soul into deeper mysteries. Until man fathoms his own universe, he cannot understand God. Know thyself is as applicable today as when the famous, immortal, and mystic utterance was inscribed on the porch of the temple at Delphi. Before this wonderful, divinely elaborated but complex system can be fully realized, it is necessary that the student should comprehend very distinctly the two states of existence, the internal and the external, and become familiar with the laws of correspondences. And it seems strange that of all sciences, that of medicine should have so completely failed to grasp this living truth, since every atom of medicine administered invariably acts upon this alchemical principle. When the human organism has become discordant in some of its parts, it is because the interstellar vibrations have aroused various states within the human kingdom into a condition of rebellion against the supreme will. Man's ignorance favors such seditious movements, and his general habits and code of morals stimulate them to undue activity. The final result is disease, disorganization of the parts and functions, and those medicines corresponding to the same functional degree of life within the grand man cure the disorder, when administered properly and in time, whereas is given to the perfectly healthy organism. The atoms produce similar symptoms to the diseases they alleviate, because it is their mission to either subdue or be subdued. And when disease prevails, the medicinal atoms, acting in unison with the natural parts and functions they affect, conquer or subdue the inharmony, and vice versa, as before stated. In all cases of disease and medicine, it is a simple question of a war between the atoms, and therefore the most potential forces within nature are always at the command of the true alchemist, because he knows both and when to select his fighting forces and when to set them in motion for the best results. Hahnemann, the founder of the homeopathic system, has approached the nearest to this alchemical truth, and as a consequence we find it is in actual practice the most natural, scientific, and successful system of medicine, yet given to the world, based as it is upon the well-known law of affinities, similia similibus curantur, like cures like, being a very ancient axiom in the astrological practice of physic. Bulwer-Lytton, who had become thoroughly convinced of the great value and importance of uniting ancient alchemy with modern medicine, makes the hero of his immortal story declare, "All that we propose to do is this, to find out the secrets of the human frame, to know why the parts ossify and the blood stagnates, and to apply continual preventives to the effects of time. This is not magic. It is the art of medicine, rightly understood. It is a fact that the molecules of the body are all changed within 12 months, that every cell in the human organism is born and grows to maturity within that space of time. Nature is absolutely impartial. She draws from the atmosphere that she may reproduce a facsimile of everything she finds upon the surface of the body. So, if there be a sore or festering ulcer, the atoms which are thrown off attract similar atoms so as to reproduce the ulcer or sore, and thus prevent the disease from getting well of itself until it has worn itself out. Further, Every vein and canal throughout the entire body, from youth to maturity, is being coated with carbonate of lime, or lime in some form. The coating of the walls of the veins in such a manner prevents the free circulation of the living matter. Then, the real vitality of the food which we eat is simply passed off through the pores, or through the bowels, or through the system, because it is unable to penetrate through the lime. If that prevention which produces old age can be attained, then physical youth will continue. The first step to take is to dissolve the lime in the body. Drink nothing but distilled water in either tea, coffee, or any other form, and drink freely of the sweet juices of the grape and apple. The food that we eat contains lime in a living form, and it is the living lime we need to build up the living bones. For the lime and the magnesia that we take in the water is crystallized dead mineral possessing no responsibility of life, and the lime in our food is quite sufficient for all purposes. For everything we take in excess, nature makes us pay the penalty. The first principle of long living is to keep all channels of the body perfect and free from coatings of lime. The second is that of youthful ideas of the mind. The soul never grows old. The third principle is dynamic breathing, which is storing up the oxygen in sufficient quantities to supply the tissues with sufficient fuel for combustion. These three principles, acting in unison, contain the true basis of physical life and a means of long living. Old age is simply the petrification of the body through lime and the incorporating of erroneous thoughts into the organism. It is the true alchemy of human existence, and the preventives in each and every case must contain the spiritual correspondence to the cause they seek to remedy. And, though the followers of Hanuman base the whole of their procedure of treatment upon their master's fundamental law of similia similibus curantur, yet there may be a few rare cases wherein this undeviating method would not apply with the required effect. In such a case, the alchemist would resort to the well-known law of opposites and base his treatment upon the dogma of contraria contrarius curantur, so long the pet theory of the allopathic school. They work upon the hypothesis that like attracts like, and if disease exists, those elements must be administered to set up the vibrations that will produce the polar opposite. If the body was racked with pain, those medicines would not be given that would create or increase similar conditions, but their antipathy would be introduced into the system or applied locally to extinguish the foe. So long as mankind remains within the semi-crystallized state of soul development, so as to require the aid of external forces to support the human throne within its earthly temple, mercenary troops will exist to supply these supposed supports. Unquestionably, the astrological law is the true system of medicine, which treats disease by sympathy or by antipathy, according to the nature of the case and the efficacy of the remedies at hand. This method is the only natural one, and has been thoroughly demonstrated by the numerous provings of drugs under Hanuman's law. Happily, the time is not far distant when the incarnated spirit will be able to use its own slumbering forces and subdue all suffering and symptoms of disease in their very first inception by virtue of its purer life and the dynamic potencies of its own interior spiritual thought. Already, mental therapeutics is taking an advanced position among liberal, progressive minds, and nothing demonstrates so clearly and forcibly the grand alchemical law of life, growth, and decay as the imponderable, invisible forces which constitute the materia medica, or remedial agents of mental, magnetic, and spiritual healing. Perhaps the most recondite subject connected with the healing art divine is the modus operandi of medicinal action upon the human body. A subject so simple and self-evident to the alchemist remains a profound mystery to the educated physician of the medical college, so much so that we are tempted to ask of them, "Can you explain the modus operandi of drugs?" Dr. William Sharp, one of the most advanced physicians of the homeopathic school, in one of his well-known essays on medicine, says, "In respect to the manner of action of drugs, we are in total darkness, and we are so blind that the darkness is not felt. Knowledge of this kind cannot be attained. It is labor lost and time wasted to go in search of it." True, hypotheses may be easily convinced, so may straws be gathered from the surface of the stream, but what are either of them worth? There is this difference between them: straws may amuse children, and hypotheses are sure to mislead physicians. It is when the occult initiate observes to what helpless conditions the practice of medicine has fallen, that he would, if he could with any possibility of success, implore the angelic guardian of the human race to open the spiritual sight of men, that they might see as he sees the divine relationship and spiritual correspondence of everything in the wide universe to man. Nature's laws move slowly and imperceptibly, yet surely and exact, and the time will certainly come when man will be forced into consciousness of these laws, whether he will or no. Nature is no respecter of persons, and those who will not move and progress in harmony with her laws of advancement must, of necessity, pass out with the old. Alchemy, as it relates to the healing art, is the most noble in its object and beneficial in its effects of all the many subdivisions of the sciences, because it alleviates the pains and morbid afflictions of suffering humanity. We have given quite sufficient of its astrological aspect in the second part of The Light of Egypt, Volume 1, wherein the four ancient elements are translated into their chemical correspondences of oxygen, hydrogen, nitrogen, and carbon, which still constitute the four primary elements of the most advanced chemistry today. They enter more or less into every organic form and substance, which is known, in various combinations and proportions. The human organism is principally composed of them, so, likewise, is the food that supports physical life, and the air we breathe is but modifications of the same atoms. As a man's constitution embraces a microscopic atom of all the essences and elements corresponding to the whole, so does the air, and much that we depend upon our food to supply can be extracted from the atmosphere by breathing. Every breath we breathe is new life or death. Herein is the secret of success or failure in certain localities and under certain conditions. If we have iron within us, could we extract or attract iron from Saturn's district? Or if the element within us could attract gold, could we obtain it from the coal fields? Therefore, it is only natural that the medical remedies we employ to restore the organism, when afflicted with disease, should group themselves into similar correspondences, and so, in a general sense, we find them, for we note that the brain, the circulation, the lungs, and the stomach are the four chief citadels of the body. The heart, of course, representing the center of circulation, and this also explains further, if that were necessary, why the principal remedies of the homeopathic system are so speedy and direct in their action. The four principal drugs, which stand as representatives of their class, are aconite, belladonna, phosphorus, and pulsatilla. These represent the quadrant, for light is not more nicely adjusted to the eye, nor sound to the ear, than aconite to the circulation, belladonna to the brain, phosphorus to the lungs, and pulsatilla to the stomach, while ramifying in the seven directions indicated by the seven primary planets, we find stimulants, tonics, narcotics, nervines, alteratives, cathartics, and diuretics as the natural material correspondences thereof. That we assign phosphorus to the lungs may appear startling to the orthodox student, especially when
He calls to mind the fact that phosphorus has long been recognized in medical science as a brain food and medicine. Anticipating such mental questions, we reply that in medicine, from the alchemical view, we are occupying a wholly different standpoint, i.e., the power of controlling the functional action of the body. In this view of the case, and the fact that the lungs and the brain are in the most perfect affinity, there will remain no mystery upon the subject. The alchemy of stones and gems attracts our next attention. Affinities and antipathies to the human constitution are to be found in these crystallized representatives of the subtle, invisible influences emanating from our planetary system. They are the mediums for the transmission of corresponding attributes and influences of existing powers and potencies, and if carried or worn upon the person, they will bring the person in direct rapport with the invisible forces within the universal system. Here again, Hahnemann's scientific philosophy would prove effectual that similia similibus curantur. Would the fiery influence of a topaz attract much from the realms of a chrysolite, or the crystallized airy forces of a sapphire be a suitable medium for the earthly forces of a jasper? Gems and stones are dead or living realities. They live, slumber, and die, and have their potent existence, as do the organic forms of matter. They are usually imbued with the vivifying spark of divinity, and shine forth and exert their influence through the magical powers attracted to them from the forces of nature. A real living entity abides within them that can be seen by the clairvoyant vision and to the trained student in occult lore. This entity can be made to become an obedient servant, giving warning of the approach of danger, impressions of men and things, and warding off discordant influences surrounding us, or that which we may contact from the magnetic and personal environments in our relations in the social world, or that which may be projected to us from the invisible realms of life. Think you the pyramids would be intact today if the stones from which they were built had been promiscuously selected? They were chosen by adepts in the knowledge of the laws of correspondence and antipathy and affinity. The Sphinx also stand as monuments to the heights of wisdom that man can attain. Metals also can be followed out on the same lines as the gems and stones. Much as we would like to continue, we are compelled to bring this discourse to a close, even though in doing so we must, of necessity, omit much of vital interest to the student. We will, therefore, only add that the 7 basic metals stand as the crystallized representatives of their respective groups: gold for the sun, silver for the moon, tin for Jupiter, copper for Venus, quicksilver for Mercury, and lead for Saturn. Each finds its own sphere of action within the temporary abiding place of the human soul on earth, the physical body. So, likewise, the 12 constellations and their corresponding talismanic gems, representing in their glittering array the anatomical zodiac of the human frame, and typifying the spiritual quality of the atoms, they are congregated in every degree of life. These and 1,000 other mysteries, had we the time, might be unfolded to the student's view with considerable advantage, but we are compelled to refrain. The philosopher's stone is near at hand. Seek it not in remote spheres or distant parts of the earth, for it is ever around you and within, and becomes the golden key of true wisdom, which prepares the soul for its higher life and brighter destiny. It is the still small voice of the awakened soul that purges the conscience from suffering and the spiritual body from earthly dross. It is that which treasures not the corrupting, delusive wealth of earth, nor the transient powers of mammon, but garners the fruits which spring from the pure life, and treasures the jewels of heaven. Vainly will you seek for the stone of the wise philosopher amid the turmoil, sufferings, and selfishness of life, unless you accept your mission upon earth as a duty delegated to the soul from heaven, eschew the evil thereof, and hold fast that which is good. To do this means to expand with the inward truth and become one of the pure in heart, in which blessed state the magical white stone, conveying a new name, reveals the living angel within to the outward man. Then and then alone doth he know the Adonai. Such are the divine spiritual principles upon which the higher alchemy of life is based. They seek only to establish a divine conscious at one-ment between the angel, the man, and the universe. And to this end, we conclude with the words of the immortal Paracelsus: to grasp these invisible elements, to attract them by their material correspondences, to control, purify, and transmute them by the ever-moving powers of the living spirit. This is true alchemy.
End of Section 9.
Section 10 of The Light of Egypt, or The Science of the Soul and the Stars, Volume 2. The Light of Egypt, or The Science of the Soul and the Stars, Volume 2, by Thomas Burgoyne. Chapter 9. Talismans. Words are the symbols of ideas and bear the same correspondence to the physical brain as matter does to spirit, a medium of expression, and are subject to continual change in their application and meaning in exact proportion to the changing mental and moral condition of the people. As the planet, as well as man, is continually progressing, so must there be a higher and nobler conception of ideas. Hence, words or expressions must change to convey the progressive spirit that is constantly taking place. Therefore, it is always interesting as well as valuable for the occult student to go to the root of each word connected with his philosophy, in order to learn the real sense in which the word was used by the ancients, from whom his mystical lore has descended. The true meaning, as well as the words themselves, have become as mystical as the lore itself. Hence, each student must commence as a beginner in any foreign language which he does not at present understand. In following this method of procedure, he will at last escape the dense and interminable confusion of modern opinions upon subjects of which the writers thereof are partially or wholly ignorant. No better illustration of this can be afforded than by the word talisman, derived from the Greek verb teleo, which means primarily to accomplish or bring into effect. But in its real and therefore higher sense, it means to dedicate, consecrate, and initiate into the arcana of the temple mysteries. But in the present day, it means a piece of imposture connected with some magical hocus pocus of the ignorant and superstitious mind, a vulgar charm that is supposed to bring the owner thereof some material benefit, irrespective of his mental, magnetic, and moral condition. And, says the learned Webster, after describing his idea of such things, they consist of three sorts: astronomical, magical, and mixed. But in what sense the astronomical differed from the magical, we are not informed, nor is any light thrown upon the peculiar nature of that class designated as mixed. In fact, the lexicographer so mixes up his definitions that we are unable to distinguish anything in particular but his own individual ignorance. So it has become in every branch of learning. Words and their meanings have become so mixed in their use and application that the world is full of discords and misunderstandings, which lead into dissensions and contention among all schools of thought, sects, and isms. And lastly, though not the least serious, it has reached into the close relations of the human family. All writers and speakers, as well as the readers and listeners, should acquaint themselves with the derivation and meaning of words.
The fact stands very clearly defined that talismans are confused in the minds of the present generation with magical charms, which depend for their effects upon the power of the idea or thought which the formulating magician impresses upon the substance of which they are composed. If the magical artist be expert and endowed with an exceedingly potent will, his charm may become very powerful when worn by the person for whom it was prepared. But if this one grand essential be lacking, no amount of cabalistical figures and sacred names will have any effect, because there can be no potency in symbols apart from the ideas and mental force they are capable of rousing in the mind of the maker. Solomon's seal is no more powerful when drawn upon virgin parchment with a weak will or in a mechanical state of mind than a child's innocent scribbling upon its slate. But if the artist realizes the mystery symbolized by the interlacing triangles and can place his soul in rapport with the invisible elements they outwardly represent, then powerful effects are often produced. I am sorry to say that the knowledge of charms is not confined to the creation of beneficial talismans. Its perversion has led to the diabolical practices of the voodoo and black magician, whose work is wholly either for gain or revenge. Nothing but the most extreme selfishness lies beneath such immoral practices. But as there must be a light to reflect a shadow, so a charm must follow a talisman. Magical charms, then, are simply natural objects, possessing but little active virtue in themselves, but owing to the mediumistic nature of their substances, are endowed with artificial powers of temporary duration, by virtue of the idea and thought impressed upon them through the mental magic of the maker, and in this sense a charm must be clearly distinguished from Tellio, the talisman. The very names suggest their difference, and above all other men, students in occultism should strive to become thoroughly educated in the true sense of the term, men of letters, by virtue of, as Ruskin calls it, the kingship of words. Charm is derived from the Latin carmen, a song that fascinates, and means to control by incantation, to subdue, while Tellio concerns the secret powers and wisdom of consecration and initiation. It is because of modern misuse of antique terms that we have considered this somewhat lengthy explanation necessary in order to clear away the accumulated debris of the ages from the true foundation of our present study. A talisman is a natural object containing the elemental forces of its own degree of life in a state of intense activity, and capable of responding to the corresponding quality of life outside of itself, that emanates from the same spiritual state, either by sympathetic vibration or antagonistic currents, the nature, power, quality, and degree of life which the various natural objects represent, being a part of the temple curriculum of initiation. Hence, the name by which the latent power of these natural objects became known was in strict harmony with the facts involved. In order to prevent any possible misconception upon the subject, let us briefly restate the definition in a different way. A talisman is the exact antipodes of a charm. This latter is the artful and temporary result of man's mental power, the former, the natural production of universal nature, and as permanent and enduring as the substance of which it is composed during the present cycle. And yet, in some sense, it may be quite correct to say that a talisman acts like a charm, and vice versa, that charms act like a talisman, providing that the real vital difference between them is maintained in the statement. Now that we have our subject clearly defined, let us carefully examine how, And in what sense a given natural object becomes talismanic? For it must appear self-evident to all that one and the same substance cannot constitute a talisman for everyone and for everything. They must naturally differ as widely in their nature and quality as mankind differ in physical, mental, moral, ethical, and temperamental development. And yet, though man may so differ from his fellow man, the ignorant Esquimaux killing seals in his kayak may belong to the same spiritual quality of life as the Harvard professor who obtains his subsistence by daily discourse upon the sublime harmony of the infinitely small with the infinitely great throughout the manifested universe of matter. And wherever we find this kinship of the spirit, we shall find the same identical talisman acting alike upon each, whenever they shall come in rapport with it. Mental, moral, and physical development never alter the real nature of the eternal man. Culture only brings to the surface into active use the latent possibilities lying concealed within the human soul. It only allows him to exercise his functions upon different planes and with different effect. Every natural department of nature corresponds to some peculiar specific quality and degree of life. These have been divided, for the sake of convenience, into 4 primary groups, and each group again subdivided into 3, corresponding to the 4 cardinal, 4 succedent, and 4 cadent houses of the astrological chart. Therefore, the 12 signs of the zodiac, these constituting the cycle of necessity within physical conditions, wherein the ever-measuring or decreasing tidal flow of life from solar radiation throughout the year represents the 12 groups of humanity, of lower animated nature, of vegetation, and crystallized gems. Every human being is ushered into the world under the direct influx of one or more of these celestial divisions, and by virtue of the sign occupying the horizon at the moment of birth, absorbs such influx and becomes endowed with a specific polarity, by virtue of which lie ever afterward, during such expression within physical conditions, inspires with every breath that specific life quality from the atmosphere, corresponding to the same degree of the universal spirit. Consequently, that gem or those gems, representing and corresponding to his house of life, become to him a talisman because of their relationship, their spiritual affinity. These are all given in the second part of Volume 1. The metals never become talismanic because of their comparatively negative degree of life, and for this reason also they make the most powerful charms. Certain combinations of metals and in proper proportions increase the potency and magnetic influence of a charm, and here, too, the laws of antipathy and affinity come into practical use. A true expert will know his metals or metal and his client before commencing his magical work. Those persons who derive most virtue from a talisman are those who belong to the most sensitive or interior state within such degree of life, and who are dominated by one sign only. Thus, if we find one sign occupying the whole of the house of life, or practically so, as when the first face of a sign ascends, we may be sure, other things not interfering, that such a native will receive great benefit from wearing its talismanic gem. If a person of good intellectual powers and sensitive spirituality be born when the Lord of the ascendant occupies the rising sign, as, for instance, correction. If a person of good intellectual powers and sensitive spirituality be born when the Lord of the ascendant occupies the rising sign, as for instance Mars in Aries or Sun in Leo, we may be sure that the talismanic gem in their case will be exceedingly powerful, because all the astrophysical conditions, and then most favorably for the expression of natural forces, and if worn upon or near that part of the body which the sign rules, the power and influence is more powerful and beneficial. In wearing them, take them to you as a part of yourself, a part of your higher self, a thing to be heeded, listened to, and obeyed. They will usually make their presence most pronounced when something arises to disturb the harmonious vibrations that naturally and quietly go on between the person and the interstellar spaces above. They are like the sensor and motor nerves. They never make their presence known except when danger encroaches. Having explained in what sense gems become talismanic, we have now to disclose the modus operandi, the how. The gems contain the life quality of their own astral nature. Man, as a higher expression only of the same universal biune life, contains the same. Like two electric currents, man, the positive pole, comparatively, attracts unto himself the mineral life of the gem, which thus becomes the negative pole. A complete circuit is formed and maintained as long as they remain in contact. Gems belonging to a different quality of life, not being in rapport with his astral state, have no good effect, because no current flows between them. Thus, the talisman acts in unison with the psychic or soul principle of man, aiding the organism to sustain health, stimulating the mental perceptions and spiritual intuition, and affording, in a remarkable manner, many premonitions of coming danger, when the individual is sufficiently sensitive to perceive them. And now, per contra, as there are gems that act in sympathy with man, there must be, and in fact are, gems that act upon contrary principles, i.e., antagonistic, and these belong to purely antagonistic elements, as air to earth and fire to water, unless the native be born under both forces, as Mars in Cancer rising, or the latter part of one sign, and nearly the whole of another of an opposite nature, occupying the ascendant. Such natives are pure neutrals, and such might wear the gems that belong to the most powerful planet of the horoscope, or that triplicity holding the most planets. Then they are usually combined, the planet and the triplicity. There are, of course, innumerable substances more or less capable of talismanic virtue to particular individuals, but those gems and similar ones that are given in The Light of Egypt, Volume 1, are the most powerful. To these may be added the opal under Scorpio, the garnet under Aries, and the turquoise under Cancer, when Saturn is therein, and the aquamarine under Pisces. And among the temporary talismans of vegetation, we may add that the young shoots bearing the flower and seed vessels are the portions of chief virtue, and the young shoots of trees. These are often used in locating mines, wells, oils, etc., that lie hidden beneath the surface of the earth, and in the hands of a negative, sensitive person, seldom fail to reward the searcher with success. These should always be gathered when their ruling correspondences are rising, or better still, culminating upon the meridian. These will be explained in the chapter on the magic wand. We have now reached the limits of our present study, and have only to state that all gems, like the human organism, are in one of three conditions: alive and conscious, asleep and unconscious, or dead and powerless. These conditions can only be discovered in stones by the trained lucid or the instructed neophyte. Stones that are sleeping require to be awakened. This, also, can only be done by the trained student or adept. Those that are dead are useless as talismans, no matter how beautiful they appear as ornaments. Gems and stones are also sexed, and those who wear them would receive the best effect if they should wear those of opposite sex, although either is powerfully potent in their influence upon the individual. How very ignorant the children of men are of the subtle, silent, yet obedient servants that everywhere surround them. Here again that divine spark, which lies embedded within the crystallized forces of nature, is exerting its subtle, spiritual influence in making man's very selfishness and love of ornament and show a means to bring forth these silent monitors, knowing ere long that their true power and potency will be known and consciously utilized by him as potent factors in his soul's evolvement and physical development. The 12 representative gems within the cold stratas of matter stand as the material representatives of their stellar counterparts in the sky and constitute the beautiful, glittering, but crystallized zodiac of man's physical anatomy. End of section 10. Section 11 of The Light of Egypt, or the Science of the Soul and the Stars, Volume 2. The Light of Egypt, or the Science of the Soul and the Stars, Volume 2, by Thomas Burgoyne. Section 11. Ceremonial Magic. The above title has been selected chiefly because, in most works treating upon magic, we find it wrongly used, and therefore take the opportunity of explaining the matter. 4. There were no such terms in the vocabulary of the ancient magi. It is unfortunate that words of ancient origin are not more carefully used, and that we should attach so many different meanings to the same word. The terms ceremony and ceremonial are nothing more nor less than what that eminent critic, John Ruskin, would designate as bastards of ignoble origin, which somehow or another have usurped the places of rite and ritual. The word rite has descended to us from the Latin ritus of our Roman ancestors, and they received it from the more ancient rita of the Sanskrit, the Greek equivalent of which is rio, and means the method or order of service to the gods, whereas ceremony may mean anything and everything, from the terms of a brutal prize fight to the conduct of divine service within the church. But no such chameleon-like definition or construction can properly be placed upon the word rite, for it means distinctly, if it means anything at all, the serious usage and sacred method of conducting service in honor of the gods or of superiors, and requires the attendance of the prophet or priest, or someone duly qualified to fulfill such sacred functions for the time being. The ritual of magic, then, is the correct title of this present study, and as such, we shall henceforth term it as we proceed with the course. Man is especially, and above all creatures, an organizing force, and when to this fact we add the most interior and powerful of his sentimental instincts, veneration for the powers that be, and for the higher, invisible forces of nature, his religiosity, as it has been aptly termed, we cannot wonder that the earliest races, of which we possess any record, are chiefly distinguished for their imposing and elaborate religious rites. In fact, it is to the stupendous temples and a colossal sacerdotalism that we are indebted for 9/10 of the relics and records which we possess of them. So true is this that, from what we have been able to discover, we are quite justified in asserting that the ancient races were, above all other things, a profoundly religious people. The temple was the center around which revolved all their genius and art, and the sacred edifice became their grandest achievement in architecture, and its high priest the most powerful individual in the state. In fact, it was in consequence of the real power invested in such sacred office that it was so intimately connected with the throne, and why royalty so frequently belonged to the priesthood or exercised priestly functions. And there can be no real doubt but that amongst the pastoral and more spiritual races of Earth's earliest inhabitants, the priest, by reason of his superior wisdom, was the first lawgiver, and, by virtue of his sanctity of person and elevation of mind, became their first primitive king, a patriarchal monarch, whose scepter and symbol of power was the shepherd's peaceful crook, just as among the ruder nomads of the inhospitable North, we find the greatest hunters invested with the dignity of chief, whose significant symbol and scepter of royalty upon their Nimrod thrones was the trusty, successful spear. And the times in which we live have had their full effect upon these symbols, so significant of rule. The monarch has transformed the spear into the less harmful mace, while the church has added an inch of iron to the crook. Therefore, the former has become less warlike, and the latter less peaceful. And verily, in actual life, we find them so. The patriarchal sire, head of the tribal household, was the original priest and the hearthstone, the first altar around which the family rites were performed. And from this pure and primitive original have been evolved through progressive ages the stately temple and the sacred person of the despotic pontiff. From the sincere prayer, the pure aspirations of the human heart, and the joyous offerings of fruits and flowers to the invisible powers around them, and from the souls of their beloved ancestors, has arisen the costly and complicated ritual of theology. And if the theologians of today really knew the lost, secret meaning of their complicated rituals, and the unseen powers lying behind their external symbols, their anxieties for the continued life of their dying creeds would be turned to new hopes and faith, which could be demonstrated to their equally blind followers, that which they were teaching they knew, and could practically use the knowledge given forth in their sanctuaries. And instead of offering up their supplications to an imaginary personal deity, their words, rites, and ceremonies would take on the form and power that such should command, and they would become truly what their title really means, a doctor of the soul. Then could they intelligently lead and direct the souls of their followers to the path of Christ, truth, which leads up to salvation, not a vicarious atonement, but gaining the at-one-ment through the individual soul's development to a conscious relation to that divine spirit we call God, where it can say, I know. Out of those simple gifts, which were the spontaneous offerings of loving remembrance and unselfish charity, have grown the prayers, penances, sacrifices, and servile worship of sacerdotalism. Out of the paternal consideration and love of the aged sire has evolved the haughty, chilling pride of the selfish, isolated priest, and which reflects its baneful influence upon the worshipers at their feet. They have also changed their once sacred, faithful, and reverent obedience into suspicion and distrust, and with the educated to utter disgust. The light has been extinguished, and priest and people alike are groping about in darkness. It is strange, yea, passing strange, the amount of human ignorance and folly that is revealed. When we look upon this picture and then upon that, Verily, we cannot help but ask the question, is mankind really progressing? We know that it is. We are keenly alive to the truth that the anthem of creation sounds out, Excelsior, move on. But how, and in what way, spiritually, we fail to comprehend. The cyclic development of the human soul is an inscrutable mystery. All the considerations above presented must be thoroughly weighed and understood in order to arrive at the true value of the dogma and ritual of high magic, as Eliphas Levi terms it, because, amid the vast array of tinsel drapery, the outcome of man's vain conceit and bombastic pride, we shall find very little that can be considered as vital and really essential to the rites of magic. The show, the drapery, the priestly ornaments and instruments are to the really spiritual occultist but as sounding brass and a tinkling cymbal. That they had and still have their legitimate uses is true, but these uses do not concern magic per se, nor its manifold powers. They awed the popular mind and impressed upon the masses a due reverence for the powers that be. They were instrumental in holding the untrained passions of the common herd in check by a wholesome fear of summary vengeance from the gods, so that this pageantry of magic, the outward priestly show, was more of a politic development than a spiritual necessity, an astute but philosophical method of enabling the educated few to govern the uneducated many. And it was only when the educational and initiatory rites of the temple became corrupt, and the priest became the persecuting ally of the king, when in real fact the priest lost his spirituality in the desire for temporal power and place, that the people began to disbelieve his professions and rebel against his tyrannical control. The powers that be are now wielding their sword of justice and unfurling the knowledge of freedom and truth to the aspiring mind of man. He has begun to feel his bondage and the yoke of oppression. The words of promise and love, instead of lifting him up to the God he has been taught to worship, bow him down in slavish obedience to his priest. Mankind cannot remain in this mental and spiritual darkness much longer. Already I see the break of day, the dawn of a new life, a new religion, or rather the reestablishing of the true, which is as old as time itself. There is but one law, one principle, one word, one truth, and one God. The original requirements for the office of priest and the rites of magic were, as shown, a primitive, i.e., pure mind, one that had outgrown the lusts and passions of youth, a person of responsibility and experience, and even to this day the priest of the Roman Church is called by the familiar title of Father. And as nature does not alter her laws and requirements in obedience to the moral development of the race, we may rest assured that the same requirements of 10,000 years ago still hold good today. You may enter your magic circle, draw with prescribed rites, and you may intone your consecrations and chant your incantations. You may burn your incense in the brazen censer and pose in your flowing priestly robes. You may bear the sacred pentacles of the spirit upon your breast and wave the magic sword to the four quarters of the heavens. Yea, you may even do more. You may burn the secret sigil of the abjurant spirit and yell your conjurations and exorcisms till you are black in the face, but all in vain, my friend, all in vain. It will prove nothing but vanity and vexation of spirit, unless the inward self, the soul, interblends with the outward world, and, contacting by its own dynamic intensity the elemental vibrations of nature, arouses these spiritual forces to the extent of responding to your call. When this can be done, but not until then, will your magical incantations have any effect upon the voiceless air. Not the priestly robes, nor magic sword, not the incantations, written word, nor mystic circle can produce nature's response to occult rite, but the fire of the inward spirit, the mental realization of each word and mystic sign, combined with the conscious knowledge of your deific powers, this, and this only, creates nature's true magician. Who and where can such be found? Are they so few that the echo answers back, where and who? Yet there are many such upon the earth at the present time, but the present mental conditions forbid them making their identity known. They would not be recognized and accepted as the true teachers, but reviled and persecuted and dubbed as insane. But silently they are sowing the seed of truth that will spring up and bear fruit where and when least expected. Because evil is so active, truth is not lying dormant. The Spirit of God, that divine spark of deity within every human soul, never sleeps, never rests. On and upward is its cry. Omnia vincent veritas. The grand sublimity of man's conception of at one with the infinite Father, at one with the limitless universe of being, at one with and inheriting all the sacred rights and inalienable prerogatives of the ineffable Adonai of the deathless soul, is the only test of man's qualification for the holy office. For, as Bulwer Lytton has truthfully said, the loving throb of one great human heart will baffle more friends than all the magician's lore. So it is with the sacred ritual. One single aspirational thought, clearly defined, outweighs all the priestly trappings that the world has ever seen. The success of all incarnations depends upon the complete unison of voice and mind, the interblend of which produces the dynamic intonation that chords with the inward rhythmic vibrations of the soul. Once this magical dynamic vibration is produced, there immediately springs into being the whole elemental world belonging thereto. By correspondence, vocalists who hold their audiences spellbound do so by virtue of the magical vibrations they produce, and are in reality practical, even though unconscious, magicians. The same power, to a degree, lies in the voice when speaking, the graceful movement of the hand when obeying the will, and the eye rays forth the same dynamic power, and becomes magical in its effects. These powers are exercised more upon the physical plane, and no better illustration can be given than the power man is able to exert over the animal when gazing into its eyes. Here, as well as in incantations and invocations, within the power of the will lies the success or failure. At this point it may be asked, what, then, is the use of magical rites, of symbols and priestly robes? We answer, in themselves alone, nothing, absolutely nothing, except the facility and convenience we derive from system, order, and a code of procedure. To this may be added the mental force and enthusiasm of soul, which such things inspire, just as men and women may feel more dignified, artistic, and refined when dressed in accordance with their ideas. So may the average priest feel more priestly, holy, and consequently more powerful mentally, when arrayed in the robes of his office and surrounded by the outward symbols of his power and functions. But in themselves alone there is not, nor can there be, any real virtue. The same may be said of the incantations. The words used in their composition are the hieroglyphics of mystical ideas. Therefore, the correct pronunciation of the words or the grammatical construction of a sentence is nothing, if the underlying idea is conceived in the mind and responded to by the soul. Will and motive form the basis of true magic. One word more and we have completed our subject. Magic swords, rings, pentacles, and wands may, and often are, powerful magical agents in the hands of the magician by virtue of the power or charm that is invested within them when properly prepared. But apart from such preparation by those who know, they are as powerless as unintelligible incantations. All the foregoing are aids, but if physical manifestations of magical forces be required, there must always be present the necessary vital magnetic pabulum by means of which such phenomena are made to transpire, and, in every case, to be successful, the assistance of a good natural magician or seer is necessary, for without this essential element the whole art in its higher aspects becomes abortive. End of Section 11.